This is a story all about how the concept of race turned upside down, so grab yourself a seat and sit right there, and I'll tell you the story of how identity politics fucked everything up and led to the rise of neo-fascism. Word. It can seem strange to people today, kids today, remember, I am very, very old, but there used to be a very different approach to the kind of social justice issues that we see today. And yet there's echoes in the past of what we're dealing with today as well. Now, many of my formative years were in the 90s because I am very old. And back then, we used to think of the way to deal with racial prejudice and other forms of prejudice was generally to treat people the same. That is, we would emphasize our common humanity and the things that we held in common, that we were all human and that these differences were superficial and meaningless, whether they be race or gender or sexuality or whatever else. You know, this was the approach, that everyone was basically the same. Of course, this was a long time ago when dinosaurs ruled the earth and it took 5 hours to download a GIF you could fap to. You know, this was a long time ago. But maybe it's the nostalgia speaking, but this seemed to work a lot better. It tended to bring people together, and in many ways these are the foundational assumptions that made the gaming community, whether it's tabletop gaming or computer gaming, into the kind of open, accepting subculture that it was. No one cared what you were, so long as you were into whatever it was the group was into. You're gay? You know, whatever, roll a dice, pick up a joystick. Do you like the tunes? You know, these are the things that were important. Yeah, you might be unusual if you're a black kid going to a goth gig or whatever, but once people got over the novelty, you were accepted as much as anyone else, and this was the way it worked. That seems superior to me as a way of addressing these issues to the way that people are dealing with it now, which seems to be to emphasize people's differences, to make your identity out of what you are rather than what you do, your identity into things you can't change rather than things that you choose and understand and choose to self-identify as. And then that gets confused with the whole constructivism versus nature debate. So can you choose what race you are? Is it purely a social construct? Yeah, it's just a confused mess. Whereas the way in which we used to approach it was, you know, be who you want to be. It doesn't matter what you are. It matters what you choose to be. That just constantly seems better looking back. You know, not that we didn't have our own issues. I mean, the animal rights people were assholes more so than they are today back in the 90s. And it's not like we didn't have problems with political correctness in the 90s. That was kind of the first blush of hyper PC culture in media and academia and schools and so on. You know, you couldn't refer to someone as being disabled. It had to be differently abled. You know, it didn't work. Of course, I mean, it meant you didn't call the kid a retard or whatever. You called him differently abled, and differently abled became the insult du jour that you would then use against people. You know. And it was parodied and ridiculed and just eventually disappeared. We seem to be on the same kind of course with that now. But this approach, the modern approach, the identity politics approach, has emphasized and made big ground out of people's differences, the things that set people apart from each other. And this seems entirely counterproductive to me. I mean, in that paradigm, no wonder that white identity has risen up. No wonder the more extreme end of the men's rights people has sprung up. Men's rights has genuine issues, but there are people who have issues in the other sense that can be associated with it, as there can be with any other movement. We certainly see that in feminism and so forth. But it's hard to see how nobody could have predicted this coming about. When you make people's differences so important, so explicit, so fundamental, when you base people's identities around what separates them rather than what brings them together, things that they don't choose, then no wonder prejudice increases. And the irony is that they were seeking to move against that. But it has been refreshing to see this turning against Antifa in the media, and this turning against identity politics in the media. There's been a rash of articles over the last couple of weeks across sites that we in the skeptic community, or whatever you want to call it, would previously have ridiculed. There's people now realizing what we realized 3 years ago, that this is out of control, that this is a problem, that it is making things worse. And for my part, I would really like to go back to the 90s approach, to say we're all human, we all have these things in common with each other, these things that divide us, race, gender, sexuality, whatever, are mostly irrelevant. It's the individual and their actions and their choices that matters. Sure, there's broad demographic differences or whatever, but the way to get past that is to treat everyone the same, to give everyone the same opportunities. And this worked. I mean, there were racial issues that led to more of this approach, but it seemed to work, at least on a personal level, at least within my generation. I couldn't point to any racists in anyone that I knew at that time. I couldn't point to anyone with prejudice against gay people, apart from one guy who had a particularly nasty encounter with what was actually a paedophile, but it left him concerned and worried, and it scarred him. So little wonder that he had developed this issue. But other than that, people were accepting, people were open, people sought to treat each other the same and let them determine for themselves how they would be treated and who and what they were. But this PC language, and it's gotten even more extreme in this iteration, it is actually much older. It goes back all the way back, as far as you want to go, really. But political correctness in the kind of proto form that we see it today really emerged with the Vietnam War.
In the future, in place of search and destroy, substitute the phrase sweep and clear.
My favourite example from that era is the phrase preemptive counterattack, which means ambush. And we see the same twisting in language in the 90s. We see the same twisting in language today, though in many ways more sinister in the way that they're trying to redefine terms like racism, sexism, even privilege is being misused as a term. And this is a genuine problem. If you allow people to control language, you allow them to control communication, and that's definitely what I feel they're trying to do. And as a writer, it's not something I'm very keen on. Clear communication is really important, and language is a fantastic tool. So allowing the enemy to occupy semantics and get away with it is not something that I'm prepared to do. Semantic arguments are important, because if you can't agree on what terms mean, you can't communicate. But I guess what I'm saying here is there seems to be an impetus finally against this negative, horrible form of identity politics and the way in which it divides people. So now feels like the time in which we should probably push even harder than we have been for individualism, for equality, for treating people the same, for treating people according to their actions, according to the content of their character. And that's going to trigger a few BLM types I know who hate white people talking about Martin Luther King, but there you go. I think he would roll in his grave at the fact that they were upset about it. But yeah, that's what I think needs to be done. A re-emphasis on the 90s style of approach to all these issues of bigotry and racism and division, and that is treating people the same, treating people as individuals, giving everyone the same rights and consideration as each other, and letting their actions determine how you feel about them. Zang.
Very catchy.